Hello everyone, welcome to the last talk of the semester. We've learned about several new things, and we understood others a little better. Today I'm going to talk about something that all of us know a little about, but not to the extent that it is actually researched. I'm talking about ludology. The term ludology comes from the Latin words ludus and logia, which roughly translates to the study of games. So creatively, the field is mostly known as game studies. But games are for kids. How could they possibly be a matter of study, right? Well, at the beginning it was not the game per se which was studied, but the impact on the population this had. In many ways, this was considered just another field of study of anthropology, or the study of humanity. Yet times change, and games now are an industry that proportionally earns more money than the movie industry. Then it's no surprise that the field is a lot broader now. Compared to other sciences, this one is rather young. It's not older than 50 years and was not taken seriously until the early 2000s. Before that, games such as Snakes or Ladders were studied the same way Mario Bros was. With the creation of the Digital Game Research Association in 2003, scholars began to grasp that games should be considered a field of study of its own. The prospect of an emerging new field of study brought many professionals to put their own flair into it. In addition to anthropologists came economists, psychologists, sociologists, and some other logists. Everyone was ecstatic to look at it from an ever-growing variety of lenses. Educators didn't hesitate to point out the great things that could be accomplished if you put the mind of a kid to work when they're allowed to get fun with it. Nevertheless, with the growing game industry, a far more intrusive scrutiny came. This one is the one that games have never been able to fully shake: violence in video games and how it affects those who play them. This issue has been so discussed that people that had never taken a controller in their lives have heard about it, and it is as old as the industry itself. The first study that focused on this topic came to the conclusion that people that played violent video games would channel any latent aggression or violent behavior onto the game itself, and it would result in the player being less violent in real life. This later became known as the catharsis theory. Well then, problem solved, or so it would seem, but in reality it was far from it. In 2001, a study came to the exactly opposite conclusion. This study that examined data from the 80s to the 2000s came up to the conclusion that the exposure to violent video games will indeed increase aggressive behavior in the players. You'd think that this would have settled the debate, yet not even a couple months passed before a sociologist pointed out several errors in the study and heavy biases that the writer had prior to writing the conclusions of his work. At least 15 different studies have been done about the subject, yet there is still no agreement among ludologists. Just to get the point across, another study performed on the Texas A&M International University that assigned random games to the participants came up with a conclusion that regardless of the video games, there was no correlation between aggressive behavior and games. Just that people that behave violently were indeed more prone to be aggressive than people that did not. Sadly, regardless of the overwhelming amount of evidence that supports the claim that violent crimes are not directly correlated to video games, this has not stopped politicians and others to make such claims in order to censor the industry. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, has mentioned several times that video games are somehow at fault when it comes to the matter of gun violence. Other organizations promote censorship or even deplatforming, arguing that little kids are playing games that are not healthy for them. Despite the fact that there are several bodies that focus on rating games for certain ages, yet the parents take no responsibility providing them without educating themselves on the matter. Fortunately, the vast majority of the criticism doesn't gain traction among the public, and the industry itself hasn't bent the knee to those loud voices. But enough of violence. Let's talk about the better side of video games. One of them, as briefly mentioned before, is education. People from non-English speaking countries benefit from video games when it comes to acquiring the language and makes it easier for them to learn it. According to a paper written by Rafael Miranda, people that play RPG games such as Final Fantasy, World of Warcraft, Soul River, and so on have a better grasp of English without formal education than those who choose not to. People who receive a formal education and are involved in these kinds of games get an edge over those that don't. There are several papers declaring the bountiful tools that video games bring to the classroom when dealing with the most complex subjects in the early stages of education. Obviously, they must be applied with moderation and with the proper guidance from a teacher. There are also several cognitive benefits. Some psychologists claim that video games improve cognitive abilities. For example, FPS games require the player to identify and react to certain cues on the screen in a matter of seconds while ignoring very intense surrounding signals, which improves visual contrast sensitivity. RTS players are required to constantly adapt to a changing environment and need to think, solve problems, and create strategies to counter or bolster the playstyle based on certain elements in order to do well in the game. All that while using mouse and keyboard to perform these tasks. The sum of these improve the brain functioning speed. The concentration capacity is also improved for those who prefer fighting or racing games, since one single mistake in a very long playthrough could shatter all they have accomplished. In contrast to what gaming was in the past, when it was mostly played in consoles alone or with one or two friends, an increasing number of video games require an internet connection. This forces the player, one way or another, to develop social skills, especially in games that require that all members of a team do well in order to win. It is not uncommon to know or be a part of a group of friends that set a day and time to play together. Those go from small groups of friends to enormous guilds that are in the hundreds of members. Contrary to popular belief, gamers are very outgoing when it comes to socializing in-game, although how it translates to the real world is yet to be correctly determined. This doesn't mean that there aren't toxic attitudes inside a certain gaming community, which may turn a gaming experience into something not really enjoyable. As we mentioned before, video games have slowly become a more profitable industry than movies, and certainly it is a very appealing place to investors. However, this isn't the only way economics can be studied within the gaming environment, for virtual economy is a very prominent field of study in ludology. Every game has a currency system. Some focus on currency obtained within the game through playing it. Others create a currency that is directly translated from real-world currency. And others have a mix of both. The economy in a game can get so real that, for example, in World of Warcraft there are what's called gold farmers, which are people that spend 8 to 10 hours a day earning in-game currency to sell for real money, much like a real job. There's a sad bit of trivia. At some point during the Venezuelan crisis, the World of Warcraft currency was worth more than the Venezuelan bolivar. As we have learned, the amount of professionals that can get insight from video games is ever expanding. Even people that have no direct links to games are making use of its growing presence to boost their popularity, such as politicians. There are several other interesting topics that we unfortunately didn't get to explore in detail, such as military application, artificial intelligence, engineering, and many more. Such is the broadness of this field. Yet we can be certain that a thing that used to be just a hobby that nerdy kids, teenagers, and adults used to call their culture will be increasingly present in the daily lives of us all, whether we play or not. We can also be certain that using the amount of data that players provide through playing video games will bring us knowledge that can be used for the betterment of mankind.